Hello and welcome to our November session of Building to Last. We're continuing with the new series that we began last month, exploring the lives of two men, Saul and David, two kings who both lived about 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus and were the first two kings of Israel. The title of this series is House of Cards, so that's been chosen for reasons that will hopefully become clearer as we look at some of the details of what happens to Saul and David in the book of 1 Samuel. Last month, Steve started us off by working through chapters 8 to 12 of 1 Samuel, helping us to explore a bit of the background as it relates to how and why Saul became Israel's first king. Not all of us were able to make that first session, so I'll recap a little bit some of the things we covered. But this month we're still focusing on Saul, and it's the next three chapters of 1 Samuel that we'll be looking at. As was the case last time, there's a lot to cover in these chapters, and it's helpful, I think, for us to keep reading them, to remind ourselves about what happened, what information we're given, and keeping all of that as fresh as possible in our minds. So if you haven't had time to read chapters 13 to 15, or if it's been a while since you last read them, then I suggest just pausing the video now and take 10 minutes or so to read through this next section of the book. Just before we get into the content of these chapters, I think it's worth asking a couple of questions. What did we learn last time? And globally, what do we find in these chapters? What are our impressions of these three chapters, having just read through them? Well, last time is a lot about how Saul came to be chosen as Israel's first king, and it was because the people wanted a king. They wanted to be like the other nations around them. And even though Samuel advised them against it, they pressed on, and God allowed them to have a king, and then God selected Saul as the king, and Saul looked the part. He was head and shoulders taller than anyone else. He was handsome. From an outsider's perspective, he looked the part of a king, but as we'll quickly discover, it wasn't a good idea to have a king or for Saul to be chosen as a king. And then in these three chapters, we find a lot of fighting, we find regret and rejection, we find a lot about Saul and Samuel. So we don't get to David just yet in these chapters, but we can compare how Saul reacts to certain situations, how Samuel reacts to certain situations, and we even have Saul's son Jonathan mentioned for the first time. The first verse of chapter 13 and the very last verse of chapter 15 are quite revealing, really. We can ask the question, what do we learn from these two verses that bookend the section that we're looking at? What do they tell us? And chapter 13 verse 1 says this: Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. And then at the end of chapter 15 verse 35, we're told that the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. So what do we learn from these verses? Well, they tell us that Saul was king over Israel for a long time. Over half his life was spent ruling God's people, but something clearly went wrong. Something must have happened to make God regret making Saul king over Israel, and that's what we're going to get into in this session. Two words that stand out to me from these three chapters are the words rejection and regret. Two words that describe God's reaction to what happens, his reaction to what Saul does. One is an emotional response, regret, and the other is an action that results from the situation. The Lord rejects Saul as king. And we've probably all experienced moments in our own lives of regret and perhaps even rejection, so we can hopefully identify to some degree with what is happening in these chapters, and we can enter into the dynamics of Saul's situation and learn from what happens. Right at the end of chapter 14, there's a verse that provides a bit of a summary of Saul's 42 years as king over Israel. All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service, and taking him into his service meant taking him into the army. Bitter war with the Philistines during the whole of Saul's life sounds pretty dreadful and difficult and depressing. Most of us haven't experienced those sorts of conditions. We don't live in the Middle East or Eastern Europe. So it's probably hard to imagine what life must really be like under those conditions, even if we see images of war on our screens or hear about it in the news. It's one of the reasons why the people said they wanted a king. We want a king over us. Then we shall be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and to fight our battles. The Philistines get mentioned a lot in the book of 1 Samuel, much more than in any other book of the Bible, in fact. But they weren't the only people that Saul fought against. 1 Samuel chapter 14 verses 47 and 48 tell us that after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobar, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. So this sounds like Saul was a good king and a good leader of the army. He fought valiantly. He defeated enemy after enemy. This sounds quite positive. And again, these two verses give us a resume of Saul's life. They tell us that his life was full of fighting battles with Israel's many enemies, the people who surrounded them. And the chapters that we're looking at today tell us about two specific conflicts. First of all, one with the Philistines in chapters 13 and 14, and then one with the Amalekites in chapter 15. Saul and the Israelites are victorious in both of these situations, but there are things going on that are not right. There are character flaws in Saul's life that begin to be revealed, and even though he was successful in defeating his enemies, there are things that we can learn from the way things go and see what happens with Saul. So we're going to start with chapter 15, which begins with Samuel the prophet giving Saul a message from God. Remember that Samuel is both a priest and a prophet. He's been serving God from a very young age. And he was the one who anointed Saul as king back in chapter 10 of 1 Samuel. Samuel stands out as someone who is close to God, someone who carefully follows God's instructions, even though he doesn't always understand why. The message is that God is going to use Saul and the Israelites to punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when Israel came out of Egypt. We can read about this event in Exodus chapter 17 and in Deuteronomy chapter 25, and in both of these passages it talks about the name of Amalek being blotted out from under heaven because of what the Amalekites did to the Israelites. So it's probably helpful just to read Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 17 to 19. Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt, when you were weary and worn out. They met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. In 1 Samuel 15 verse 2, we're told the message that Samuel gives to Saul. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. And this is immediately followed by an instruction in verse 3. Now go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put them to death, men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. So this is a very clear command. The thing that God is ordering Saul and his army to do is to completely wipe out this nation, all the people, all the animals. And this sounds horrific to us. It doesn't fit with the way that we would go about things today. And it's right to ask the question, why would God give such an instruction to completely wipe out the Amalekites? Why would God do that? So let's do that now. Let's pause to think about why God did this, why God told Saul to do this. Because ever since the early chapters of Genesis, death and destruction and killing and wars have been a common theme in every book. So what do we think of God giving this instruction to Saul? What does this say about God? And what does it tell us about God's purposes and character? And then finally, what questions are raised for us personally as we consider the message that Samuel gives to Saul. So I'm going to pause the video now and take a little bit of time just to reflect on these questions. If there are other people around to discuss these with, that would be very helpful. But take 5-10 minutes now just to think about these questions. Perhaps all we can say from this situation is that God must have had his reasons for acting in this way. God must have had reasons for giving this instruction to Saul, and then allow that idea to shape our view of who God is, rather than perhaps imagining that God would never act in this way. There's a lot in Scripture about fearing the Lord, and it comes up in almost every book of the Bible. At the same time, there's a repeated emphasis on the goodness of the Lord and on his loving kindness and faithfulness. Ultimately, God is the judge of all the peoples of the earth. And we need to keep that in mind, as well as remembering that by nature he is gracious and compassionate. Now, it's very easy to take God's grace and love for granted. We need to stay humble and thankful, otherwise we can easily fall into the trap of becoming selfish, arrogant, ungrateful, which seems to be our natural tendency as human beings. So in fact, these are important chapters that teach us about human nature and the importance of growing in our knowledge of God, continuing to grow in our knowledge of God. So moving on, let's read about how Saul reacts to this instruction from God. So Saul summoned the men and mustered them at Telaim, 200,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 from Judah. Saul went to the city of Amalek and set an ambush in the ravine. So it looks like Saul is going to do what the Lord has told him to do. He assembles a huge army and gets them into position for attack. The next thing we're told is that he warns the Kenites, who are a neighbouring tribe, and he tells them to go away from the area so that they'll not get caught up in the fighting and destroyed with the Amalekites. It's not really clear if this is Saul's own initiative or something that the Lord has directed him to do, but the reason for it is clearly stated. The Kenites showed kindness to the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. And this is the complete opposite of how the Amalekites behaved towards the Israelites, and it suggests that God sees how differently these two tribes responded to his people escaping from slavery in Egypt. The Kenites helped them, and the Amalekites took advantage of them and attacked them. So then the very next verse tells us that Saul attacked the Amalekites all the way from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt. He took Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive, and all his people he totally destroyed with the sword. But Saul and the army spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything that was good. These they were unwilling to destroy completely, but everything that was despised and weak they totally destroyed. Now we've all read the rest of the chapter, so we know what's going to happen next, but if we pause again and just ask the question, what's going on here? What do we think of Saul's motivation and mindset in this situation? What is he thinking about? What seems to be Saul's plan for Agag and the very best of the animals? So again, take a few minutes just to pause the video and reflect on these questions. It seems to me that Saul thinks that he knows best. He hasn't entirely followed God's instructions. He's killed a lot of people and a lot of animals, but Agag has been spared, and some of the very best animals too. So it seems like Saul thinks that he's done enough to satisfy God. He's close enough to fulfilling what God has told them to do. Surely that's okay. And I don't think he's worried about the situation. I think he He thinks that he's done enough, but he's in for a bit of a shock. If we read on, verse 10 of chapter 15 tells us this. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. It's the same word that we find used in Genesis chapter 6 in the introduction to the account of Noah, where God says that he regretted that he made human beings on the earth and that his heart was deeply troubled. And we know what happens next in the story of Noah. We know that God brought about a flood to destroy all the living creatures on the earth except those that were on board the ark that God had told Noah to build. This rejection of Saul as king is because he had turned away from God and had not followed his instructions. That's the message that Samuel receives from the Lord. And Samuel's reaction to hearing that is one of deep distress. Samuel was angry and he cried out to the Lord all that night. So it's worth thinking, why did Samuel respond in this way? What was it that upset Samuel, and why did he have such a strong reaction? And perhaps it was that Samuel really liked Saul and feared what was going to happen to him. Perhaps he was frustrated with how things had turned out and was worried about what that would mean for his people. It's possible that Samuel couldn't see anything good coming from this situation, was concerned with who would be chosen as king as a replacement for Saul, and how would Saul react to being rejected as king over Israel. For the moment, however, it would seem that Saul sees things quite differently. First of all, we're told that early in the morning Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honour and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. So in Saul's mind, he's done something that's great, something that's worthy of setting up a monument in his own name. But that suggests that he's no longer looking at the Lord for the victory that he's won, but he's looking at what he himself has achieved. Then we're told that when Samuel reached him, Saul said, "The Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions." So here, again, it reveals how Saul is thinking about the situation. He says to Samuel that he's carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, "What then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear?" Samuel knows that things aren't right, that Saul hasn't carried out what he should have. So Saul starts to make excuses. Saul answers, "The soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest." And Samuel's response is to ask him the question, why did you not obey the Lord? And again, Saul comes back, "But I did obey the Lord. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king." In Saul's mind, he's done what he was asked to do. But Samuel brings this message: because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And it's at that point that Saul seems to recognise the seriousness of what he's done. Because he says to Samuel, "I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them." And here we have a realisation from Saul that what he did, he knew he was doing wrong. He was motivated by fear of the men in his army, and he gave in to what they wanted him to do rather than what the Lord had told him to do. And that's very revealing, isn't it? But this isn't the first time that Saul has failed to do what God had instructed. Here we see Saul not doing some of the things that he should have done. If we go back to chapter 30 now, this is a situation where they're up against the Philistines. And the Philistines, having been attacked by Jonathan, one of their outposts, amass a huge army against the nation of Israel. And this is the reaction. When the Israelites saw their situation was critical and their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. They were frightened. They were frightened of this huge army. It's the same fear that drove Saul in chapter 15. Here we find it in chapter 13. And it's made explicit in chapter 13, verse 7. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited for 7 days, which was the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. We can imagine the situation. Huge army up against them. Saul has his men, but some of them are hiding. They're frightened. And then after 7 days waiting for Samuel to come, the men begin to scatter. And that's the moment where Saul begins to panic. But what's this referring to? The fact that the time set by Samuel. Well, if we go back a few chapters, after having appointed Saul as king, the very same day, Samuel gives him an instruction from the Lord. He tells Saul, "Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." So this is part of the instructions given to Saul. Several of the instructions Saul saw fulfilled on that day that he was anointed king, but this one is for later on. And he's obviously still aware of that when he is facing the Philistines, because he chooses, having waited for Samuel for 7 days, he chooses to act differently. So having waited for 7 days, and the men begin to scatter, he says, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offerings. So Saul takes the initiative in the situation. He sees what's going on around him, and he offers the burnt offerings. And just as he finishes making the offering, Samuel arrives, and Saul goes to greet him. And Samuel asks the question, "What have you done? What have you done?" So again, Saul makes some excuses. He replies, "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." So this is the situation. Saul, as king, has been told what to do by Samuel, but because of the situation, he responds differently. He takes things into his own hands. He sees the Philistines coming down. He sees that the men were scattering. He thinks to himself, "I haven't sought the Lord's favour." And he feels compelled to offer the burnt offering, something that was Samuel's role to do. And Samuel tells him that he's done a foolish thing. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time." So this brings it home to us how important it was that Saul did what God had asked him to do. In chapter 15, we see Saul not doing everything that God had asked him to do by sparing Agag and some of the animals. Here we see Saul doing things that he shouldn't have done. He goes beyond what he should have done, and he offers the sacrifices. And he seems to present it as something to seek the Lord's favour, but by ignoring what God had said, by ignoring the instructions that God had given, effectively he'd done a foolish thing. So Samuel gives him the bad news. "Now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." And it's this keeping the Lord's command that's underlined. And it's exactly the same thing that caused problems in chapter 15. So the issue here is whether or not Saul as king will do what God has asked him to do. There are other things going on in these chapters as well that reveal character flaws on the part of Saul. In chapter 14, there's a whole series of events where Saul, again in a battle situation, tells the army not to eat for the whole day. And then Jonathan comes along and he tastes some honey. And that's something that Saul then gets very angry about, to the point where he's willing to kill Jonathan because he feels like that's gone against what he had vowed to God to do. But there again, we see him making his own rules in the situation, taking his own initiatives, rather than listening carefully to what God has said. So how does that impact on us? We see Samuel doing things that he shouldn't have done. We see Samuel not doing things that he should have done. And that's similar to our lives and our experience, isn't it? That sometimes we do things that we shouldn't do, sometimes we don't do things that we should do, and we call that sin. And if it wasn't for God's grace, we would find ourselves in exactly the same situation as Saul, being rejected. In fact, that was our situation before hearing and responding to the gospel. Sometimes those things are motivated by fear too, fear of what other people will think, fear of the situation, of the consequences, of the threat or the opposition that's against us. We sin for all sorts of reasons. But Jesus saves us from our sin. That's the gospel, that's the good news. And yet we need to think about how we live our life of faith, how we live our lives as Christians. When Jesus had paid the price for sin, when after his crucifixion, after his resurrection, just before he goes back to his Father in heaven, he calls his disciples to him and he says that all authority in heaven and earth had been given to him. All authority had been given to Jesus in heaven and on earth. This is Jesus as King, the ultimate King and the perfect King, the King that we need, unlike Saul, a king who would keep the commands that he'd received and do the things that his father had asked him to do. And so he's given all authority. He is the King above all kings. And he gives this instruction to go and make disciples of all nations. And it's a familiar instruction at the end of Matthew's Gospel. It's Jesus commissioning his followers, his disciples, to go and make disciples, to continue what Jesus has started to do. And baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit is the first thing that he says. But then he says, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And here we can see the echo of what happened with Saul. Everything that God had told Saul to do, the very detail of it, was important. And Saul failed because he failed to take those instructions seriously. And Jesus says, as we make disciples, we need to teach people to obey everything that Jesus commanded. Not some of the things, but everything that Jesus commanded. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. And that's really important. It's important that we don't leave things out. It's important that we don't add things to what Jesus has said. When we do that, I think we find ourselves getting into trouble. But paying attention to Jesus' words, to what he says, to his promises, and to all of his words, taking those words to heart, is really what it means to be a disciple. And we know that we're going to fail. We know that we're not perfect, but Jesus is perfect. He is the perfect King. Jesus made the connection between obedience to his instructions and love. So in John's Gospel, several times he repeats the same idea, but in these verses 23 and 24, makes it very clear. Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. So here we see the connection between love and obedience, something that Jesus modelled perfectly. Jesus always obeyed his Father because he knew that he was loved, and he loved his Father in heaven. And love as a motivation for obedience rather than fear is really important. In Romans, Paul expresses the same thing. Through Jesus we received grace and apostleship to call all the nations to the obedience that comes from faith for his name's sake. The obedience that comes from faith. So again, faith motivated by love, faith motivated by trust in God, obedience that's motivated by trust in God, obedience that comes from faith is the kind of obedience that God is looking for. And so, as Steve mentioned in the first session, the things that we've read about in these chapters, the things that we read in the Bible, were written for a purpose. And Romans 15 verse 4 explains what that purpose is. Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us. So through the endurance taught in the scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Everything that was written in the past was written to teach us. So when we read these chapters, we're asking the question, what do these chapters teach us? What does the story of Saul teach us? What can we learn from what we read? Because everything that was written in the past was written to teach us. And in Hebrews, it underlines the importance of what we read. We must pay the most careful attention to what we've heard so that we do not drift away. How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? So paying careful attention to what we've been taught, to what we read in the Bible, to what we've heard is essential so that we don't drift away. How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? Because the reality is that we can't perfectly obey God. Jesus did, but we can't and we don't. But what the gospel offers us is a way out from sin. It offers us forgiveness for all the things that we've done wrong. But that offer, that gospel message, if we ignore that, then how can we escape the problem of our own disobedience and sin? That's the question. So for us, obedience is important. For us, obedience is what we're aiming for, what we're trying. But realistically, we're not perfect. We're not always obeying God perfectly. We're doing things that we shouldn't do. We're not doing things that we should do. But Jesus offers us salvation. And if we fail to hold on to that salvation, if we fail to hold on to the words and the promises that Jesus spoke and that are recorded for us in the Bible, then there's no other way out from sin. There's no other, no matter how much we try, no matter how much self-improvement we attempt, the reality is that the only way to be rescued from our sin is through holding on to what Jesus said, paying careful attention to all that Jesus taught. That's why making disciples is about teaching people to obey everything that Jesus commanded. We know that they won't do it perfectly, just as we don't do it perfectly. But the idea of obedience that comes from love, obedience that comes from faith, relying on our perfect King, who is Jesus, that is what the Christian life is all about. So do keep reading through 1 Samuel. There's a lot more to get out of this book. There's a lot more still to learn about Saul. And next time we will begin to be introduced to David. So that's well worth waiting for next time.